This is BBC World News Today with me, Rajat Ahmed. The headlines: Russian track and field athletes are banned from the Rio Olympics. The governing body of world athletics, the IAAF, upholds their suspension over allegations of systematic doping.
The IAAF Council was unanimous that RUSAF had not met the reinstatement conditions and that Russian athletes could not credibly return to international competition.
A 94-year-old former Auschwitz guard is convicted in Germany of being an accessory to the murder of 170,000 people. British police investigating the murder of MP Cox say alleged links to right-wing extremism are a key line of inquiry. And coming up, Turkey's tourism in the doldrums. The country struggles as it loses billions in revenue. Hello and welcome. Russian track and field athletes will not be able to compete at the Rio Olympics this year. The president of the IAAF, the governing body of world athletics, Sebastian Coe, says an existing ban on the Russian Athletics Federation over doping allegations will remain in place. But there's a glimmer of hope for some Russian athletes. The chairman of the IAAF's inspection team, Rune Andersson, said some might be able to compete, although not under their nation's flag.
The task force does.
Well, Alex Kapstik was at the news conference in Vienna. Let's have a chat to him now. Alex, can you give us a sense of how unprecedented this ban is?
Well, it's never happened before to ban an entire nation from competing in the track and field programme. This is the blue ribbon event at the Olympics. It's unprecedented and it's one that has been greeted with disappointment back in Russia, although I think talking to the General Secretary of the Russian Athletics Federation, it's one that they probably expected, especially after this week's report from the World Anti-Doping Agency, which highlighted existing flaws that exist within the testing programme in Russia. There was talk of urine samples that were faked. There was talk of intimidation of the testers from Secret Service agents in Russia. So perhaps not that unexpected, but from Russia. And as far as the IAAF were concerned, well, they just came to the conclusion that Russia had not done enough, that the ban should remain in place because they hadn't met the criteria laid out. And the task force, the man who led the task force, you heard him there, Rune Andersson, he stated quite clearly three of those criteria that hadn't been met. They were that the deep-seated culture of tolerance in Russia, that was still there. There was still doping. There was a culture of doping. It hadn't gone. He said that a strong and effective anti-doping infrastructure wasn't in place still. And he also said there are detailed allegations which are already partly substantiated that the Ministry of Sport, far from supporting the anti-doping effort, had in fact orchestrated systematic doping. That's why they came to the conclusion. Lord Coe said it was a difficult decision, but it was a unanimous decision. That's why they've come to the conclusion that Russian athletes cannot compete in Rio.
Alex, there was some suggestion that Russia was hoping the IOC might overturn this ban. How likely is that?
Well, there was speculation beforehand that the IOC, who are meeting next week in a so-called anti-doping summit, would come to some sort of compromise to allow some Russian athletes who could prove they were clean to take part in Rio. And the IAAF today have headed that off a little bit with their own compromise. They're saying that athletes who can prove they are clean, and by saying that they have to prove that they've been operating outside the Russian system, for example, working with foreign coaches abroad outside of the country. If they can show that, then they might be able to compete as individuals, but not under the Russian flag, under a neutral flag. I'm not sure how well that will go down with the Russians, and the Russians now are pinning their hopes on this meeting at the International Olympic Committee next week. They still haven't given up hopes that more of their athletes will be able to compete, but compete under the Russian flag.
Alex Kapstik there in Vienna, thank you very much. Well, with me is Olga Ivshina from our Russian service here in Broadcasting House. Olga, first of all, have you been noticing any reaction out of Russia? Any particular strong reactions?
Oh yeah, officials are reacting, of course, and sportsmen are reacting, and of course they all say that they're extremely dissatisfied with this reaction, and Russian Sports Minister Vitaly Mutko has already said that they're going to take this case into court. And he hasn't specified which court yet. And also some Russian sportsmen, so to say clean sportsmen, they also say that they're going to appeal this decision. And for example, two-times Olympic champion Yelena Isinbayeva, who this is her fifth Olympic Games, might be her fifth Olympic Games, and she's two-times Olympic champion. She has never been caught, and she claims that her dreams has been stolen. And yeah, she's going to appeal, and she still hopes, she begs to let her participate in these games.
Presumably it's hoped that this sort of ban is going to encourage Russia to change its ways. Do you think that's going to be the reaction now within the country, within the culture in sport?
It's hard to say, Russian state media and some Russian officials, they have been extremely defensive towards their sports structures, towards their sportsmen. For example, they still claim that there is no direct evidence of Russian officials supporting or promoting doping. They just say that this all is based, on words of some athletes or some officials who fled Russia. So they basically picture this as an anti-Russian conspiracy, as just a political thing which happened. That's why I think it's unlikely. There has been a huge job done, but I don't know whether they are ready to implement further changes.
We're hearing that some Russian athletes outside of the system might be allowed to compete under some sort of neutral flag. Do you think that they'll do that, or will there be a sense of national pride that they won't want to compete if their compatriots can't?
A few sportsmen have already said that then they won't participate on the International Olympic Committee flag. It's also interesting, that, for example, the same Yelena Isinbayeva, she has always been training in Russia and she has never been caught. So it doesn't really depend on the coach you're using. I think it depends on your dedication, on your attitude. But I mean, the atmosphere in the country is the following, that I guess they won't risk participating on the International Olympic Committee flag because they might be perceived as traitors if they do so.
Olga Ivshina, thank you very much for your time. In the past hour, British police have said that they are investigating links to right-wing extremism and the mental health of the man suspected of killing the MP Joe Cox yesterday. The BBC also understands police have found Nazi regalia, including Nazi literature, in his home. Tom Mayer, who's 52, is currently in police custody. Our correspondent Daniel Sanford has more. British Prime Minister David Cameron and the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn have visited the West Yorkshire village of Burstall to pay their respects to Joe Cox. They laid flowers at a monument near where she was attacked, and the British Parliament will be recalled on Monday for MPs to pay tributes to their colleague. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas reports. And now a look at some of the day's other news. A search team has recovered the second flight data recorder from the Egypt Air plane that crashed last month in the Mediterranean. It's been found a day after the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder was recovered. The Airbus 320 disappeared on its way from Paris to Cairo with 66 people on board. American rock star Meat Loaf has been taken to hospital after collapsing on stage during a concert in Canada. Video footage filmed by fans in Edmonton captures the moment the 68-year-old singer fell to the ground. A statement on Meat Loaf's Facebook page said he had suffered severe dehydration but is expecting a speedy and full recovery. A crater on Mars has been named after one of the villages worst hit by the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. The International Astronomical Union has named the 9.8-kilometre crater as Langtang. At least 215 people were killed in the village when the quake triggered an avalanche. A 94-year-old former Auschwitz guard has been convicted of being an accessory to the murder of 170,000 people. Reinhold Hanning was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in facilitating the slaughter at Auschwitz death camp. Jenny Hill reports from the city of Detmold, where the trial took place. It was the world's 6th most popular tourist destination, but visitor numbers to Turkey have slumped by around 40%. It's after security threats and a row with Moscow after a Russian jet was shot down by Turkey last year. Well, Turkey stands to lose billions of dollars in tourist revenue, and there's little hope of a return to stability. Our Turkey correspondent Mark Lowen reports from Antalya. Now, this time tomorrow, Tim Peake will have landed back on Earth in Kazakhstan. During his 6 months on board the International Space Station, he conducted more than 250 experiments, carried out a spacewalk and ran a marathon. But as our science editor David Shukman reports, his final challenge is to return home to Earth safely. The latest football game at Euro 2016 was briefly stopped after flares were thrown onto the pitch. The referee halted the match between Croatia and the Czech Republic for 4 minutes after at least 8 flares were thrown onto the pitch. They appeared to have come from the Croatian supporters section. Croatia were leading 2-1 at the time. After play resumed, the Czechs managed to equalise. The early game was won 1-0 by Italy over Sweden, and Spain against Turkey kicks off in about half an hour. Well, we just want to take you now to Westminster in London, live to Westminster, where a vigil is underway for the MP Joe Cox, who was killed yesterday. You can see a small gathering there. This is in Parliament Square in London, near Westminster Abbey and near the Parliament. And people are gathering just to pay their respects. The Labour MP Joe Cox died after being shot and stabbed multiple times following a constituency meeting. The latest we're hearing today is that UK police are probing far-right links of the murder suspect, and they're also looking at the mental health of the suspect. They've said that that's a clear line of inquiry, and it's certainly something that has affected the entire country here in Britain, and that was the Labour MP Joe Cox, who was killed this week. Well, that's it from the programme. Next, the weather. But from now, for me, Regid Ahmed, and the rest of the team, goodbye.